My name is Catherine Wright, but everyone has always called me Cathy, and at 76 years old, I discovered that the children I had devoted my entire life to raising saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be warehoused away. I was standing in my kitchen, still wearing my gardening gloves from tending to the tomatoes I'd been growing for 43 years in the same backyard, when my daughter Rebecca walked through my front door without knocking, followed by my son Daniel, and a woman in scrubs carrying a clipboard who introduced herself as Linda from Meadowbrook Care Facility. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun was streaming through the lace curtains I had sewn myself decades ago, casting familiar patterns across the linoleum floor, where I had taught both my children to tie their shoes, and suddenly these three strangers were standing in my sanctuary discussing me like I wasn't even present. Rebecca, my firstborn who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, was explaining to the woman in scrubs that I had become forgetful, that I was a danger to myself, that just last week I had left the stove on and could have burned the whole house down. I remember standing there with dirt still under my fingernails, trying to process what was happening, because I knew I hadn't left any stove on. I knew my mind was as sharp as it had ever been, but nobody was looking at me for confirmation. Daniel, my baby boy who used to make me construction paper cards every Mother's Day until he turned 16, was nodding along with everything Rebecca said, adding his own concerns about how I had been driving to the grocery store alone, how the neighbors had called him worried about my safety, how it was time to face reality. The woman from Meadowbrook was writing everything down, occasionally glancing at me with the kind of practiced sympathy that told me she had done this hundreds of times before, that I was just another confused elderly person whose family was making the responsible choice. I tried to interrupt to tell them that I had been taking care of myself perfectly well, that I had been gardening and cooking and managing my own household for decades without any help from either of them. But Rebecca held up her hand like she was stopping traffic and said, we would discuss it later, that right now they needed to focus on getting the paperwork completed. The woman from Meadowbrook explained that they had a lovely room available, that the facility offered activities and medical supervision, that I would be much safer there than rattling around in this big old house by myself. I looked around my kitchen at the copper pots hanging from hooks my late husband Frank had installed, at the windowsill herb garden I watered every morning, at the refrigerator covered with photos of grandchildren who barely called me anymore, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't a discussion or a family meeting. This was an ambush, and my own children were the ones holding the weapons. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of signatures and preparations that felt like watching someone else's life fall apart in fast motion. Rebecca had already contacted a moving company to pack up what she called my essentials, which apparently consisted of one suitcase of clothes, my medication, and a single photo of Frank that she grabbed from the mantel. Everything else, she explained, would need to be sorted through later, though she was vague about when that might happen, and who would be doing the sorting. I tried to assert some control over the situation by insisting that I needed to pack my own belongings. There were specific items I couldn't live without, but Daniel just patted my shoulder in that condescending way people use with children and told me not to worry, that they would make sure I had everything I needed. When I asked about my garden, about who would water my tomatoes and harvest the beans that were almost ready, Rebecca rolled her eyes and said, the new owners would deal with the landscaping however they saw fit. It was only then that I realized they had already decided to sell my house, the home where Frank and I had raised our family, where I had planned to live out my remaining years, surrounded by memories and the rhythms of a life I had built with my own hands. The woman from Meadowbrook was explaining their meal schedule and activity programs, while my children discussed real estate prices and the best strategy for a quick sale, and I understood that my opinion about any of this was not only unwanted, but completely irrelevant. The ride to Meadowbrook Care Facility was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I sat in the back seat of Daniel's sedan, clutching my purse and watching the familiar streets of my neighborhood disappear behind us, knowing that I might never see them again. Rebecca sat up front, giving Daniel directions she had printed from the internet, occasionally turning around to reassure me that this was all for the best, that I would make friends and have people to look after me properly. I stared out the window at the shopping centers and office buildings that had replaced the farmland I remembered from when we first moved to this area, back when Rebecca was in elementary school and Daniel was still in diaper, and I tried to understand how I had become someone whose entire existence could be dismantled and relocated in a single morning without anyone considering whether I wanted it to happen. Meadowbrook Care Facility turned out to be a sprawling complex of connected buildings painted in cheerful yellow and blue, with manicured lawns and decorative flower beds that looked nothing like the wild, productive garden I had cultivated behind my own house. The entrance lobby was designed to look welcoming with its overstuffed furniture and fake fireplace, but everything smelled like industrial disinfectant, and that particular combination of cafeteria food and old age that I would later learn permeated every corner of the building. Linda from admissions guided us through the intake process, with the efficiency of someone who had perfected a routine, explaining the facility's policies while we walked past common areas filled with elderly residents staring at television screens or dozing in wheelchairs. My room, when we finally reached it, was a small square space with 2 single beds, a shared bathroom, and a window that looked out onto the parking lot where Daniel's car sat like an escape vehicle I would never be allowed to use. My roommate was a tiny woman named Dolores, who barely acknowledged our presence, too absorbed in a soap opera playing on the small television mounted high on the wall between our beds. Rebecca busied herself unpacking my single suitcase into the narrow closet while Daniel stood in the doorway looking uncomfortable, probably realizing for the first time that this sterile little room was where he had decided his mother should spend whatever years she had left. When it was time for them to leave, Rebecca hugged me with the same perfunctory affection she had shown me since she turned 18, and decided I was an embarrassment to her sophisticated lifestyle. Daniel promised to visit soon, though something in his voice suggested that soon was a flexible concept that might stretch longer than either of us expected. And then they were gone, and I was alone in a room that smelled like bleach and sadness, listening to Dolores mutter complaints about the television volume while I tried to figure out how my life had been reduced to this. The first week at Meadowbrook was an education in institutional living that I had never wanted to receive. Meals were served at rigid times in a dining hall where conversations were limited to complaints about the food and updates on various medical conditions. Activities consisted of bingo games and crafts projects designed for people with dementia, led by cheerful young staff members who spoke to everyone like they were children who needed constant encouragement to participate. My days were structured around medication times and meal schedules, with little consideration for the fact that I had spent 76 years managing my own routine, according to my own preference. I was expected to be grateful for the supervision in the company, but mostly I felt like I was serving a prison sentence for the crime of growing old in a society that had decided elderly people were problems to be solved rather than human beings, deserving of dignity and choice. The other residents were a mix of people dealing with genuine cognitive decline, and others like me who seemed to have been deposited there by families who found it easier to pay for professional care than to deal with the inconvenience of aging parents. I met Eleanor, a former librarian whose daughter had moved her to Meadowbrook after she fell once in her apartment, and Margaret, a retired teacher whose son lived 3 states away and visited twice a year if she was lucky. During those first days, I spent a lot of time sitting by my window watching the parking lot, memorizing the patterns of when families came to visit and how long they stayed. Most visits lasted less than an hour, with adult children checking in just long enough to ease their guilt before returning to their busy lives. I began to understand that Meadowbrook wasn't really about caring for elderly people. It was about providing a convenient solution for families who didn't want to deal with the messy realities of aging. Rebecca came to see me exactly once during that first week, bringing a small bouquet of flowers from the grocery store and a chatty update about her job and her husband's recent promotion. She asked how I was adjusting, but her tone suggested she wanted reassurance rather than honesty, so I told her I was fine and watched her relax visibly at my cooperative response. She stayed for 37 minutes, spending most of that time on her phone dealing with work emails, before announcing that she needed to get back to the office. Daniel didn't visit at all, though he did call once to ask how I was settling in, a conversation that lasted less than 5 minutes, and consisted mostly of him telling me about his latest business trip and his son's soccer season. When I tried to express how much I missed my garden and my own kitchen, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. He reminded me that this arrangement was temporary just until we could figure out a better long-term solution, though he was vague about what that solution might involve or when it might materialize. It was during my second week at Meadowbrook that I began to pay closer attention to how the facility operated, not just as a resident subjected to its routines, but as someone trying to understand the business model that kept it running. I noticed which staff members seemed genuinely caring and which ones were just collecting paychecks. I observed how different families interacted with their elderly relatives, and I started asking questions about things like ownership structure and financial management. The director of the facility was a woman named Patricia Hendricks, who made periodic rounds through the common areas, speaking to residents with the kind of professional warmth that never quite reached her eye. I had worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company for 32 years before I retired, so I recognized the look of someone constantly calculating costs and revenues, someone more concerned with profit margins than with the quality of life for the people who generated those profits. During one of her visits to our wing, I struck up a conversation with Patricia about the facility's history and operations, presenting myself as a curious new resident rather than someone conducting informal reconnaissance. She told me that Meadowbrook had been family-owned for 15 years, but that the original owners were looking to retire and had been considering various offers from interested buyers. The facility was profitable, she explained, but the regulatory requirements and staffing costs were becoming increasingly challenging to manage. That conversation planted a seed of an idea that grew stronger every day as I watched the inadequate staffing levels, the bland institutional food, the limited activities, and the general atmosphere of warehousing elderly people rather than helping them maintain meaningful lives. I began to think about the substantial nest egg Frank and I had accumulated over our 47 years of marriage, money that was currently sitting in various accounts and investments while I was trapped in this place against my will. Frank had been careful with money his entire life, working as a supervisor at the power plant while I managed our household finances and contributed my bookkeeper's salary to our savings. We had lived modestly, paid off our mortgage early, and invested wisely for our retirement year. Frank had always said that money was meant to provide security and options, and as I sat in my shared room listening to Dolores complain about the night shift nurses, I began to consider what options my financial resources might actually provide. I started making casual inquiries about the facility's financial situation, talking to staff members who had been there for years, and understanding their frustrations with low wages and poor working conditions. I learned that the current owners were asking $2 million for the property and business, a figure that would normally be far beyond the reach of any individual resident, but that happened to fall well within the range of what Frank and I had saved over our lifetime. The more I thought about it, the more the idea made sense, not just as a way to escape my current situation, but as an opportunity to create the kind of place where elderly people could live with dignity rather than simply being managed like inventory. I had spent my entire adult life taking care of other people, first my children and then Frank during his final illness, and I understood what genuine care looked like versus the institutional simulation of care that Meadowbrook provided. 3 weeks into my residency, I called my lawyer, Edward Morrison, who had handled Frank's estate, and helped me navigate the financial complexities of widowhood. I told him I wanted to explore purchasing Meadowbrook Care Facility, and after a long pause during which I could practically hear him questioning my mental state, he asked if I was serious about making such a significant investment at my age. I explained that I was not only serious but that I had already begun researching the facility's operations and financial history, that I understood this would be a complex business transaction, requiring careful legal and financial planning, and that I wanted him to begin the preliminary negotiations immediately. Edward had known me long enough to recognize when I had made up my mind about something, so he agreed to contact the current owners and begin exploring the possibility of a sale. The prospect of owning Meadowbrook gave me a sense of purpose and energy that I hadn't felt since Frank's death 3 years earlier. I began paying even closer attention to every aspect of the facility's operations, from the quality of the meals, to the frequency of room cleaning, to the way staff members interacted with residents. I took notes on everything, developing a comprehensive understanding of what needed to be changed and how those changes might be implemented. I also started building relationships with other residents, not just making polite conversation, but really listening to their stories and understanding what had brought them to Meadowbrook. I learned about family dynamics and financial pressures, about health scares and housing problems, about all the different ways that elderly people could find themselves removed from their chosen living situations and deposited in institutional care whether they wanted it or not. Eleanor, my librarian friend, had been living independently in a small apartment for 8 years after her husband died, managing her medications and her finances perfectly well until she fell getting out of the shower and spent one night in the hospital for observation. Her daughter used that single incident as evidence that Eleanor could no longer live safely alone, despite Eleanor's protests that the fall was a fluke and that she had no intention of giving up her independence. Margaret, the retired teacher, had been teaching literacy classes at her local community center and volunteering at the food bank, until her son decided that her 4-hour drive to visit him twice a year was evidence of cognitive decline. Ignoring the fact that she had been making that same drive without incident for 15 years, her son had sold her house and moved her to Meadowbrook without consulting her about what she wanted or needed. As I listened to these stories and dozens of others like that, I realized that most of us had been railroaded into institutional living, not because we were incapable of managing our own lives, but because our families found it easier to delegate our care to professionals rather than support our independence. We had become inconveniences to be managed rather than people whose preferences and autonomy deserved respect. The more I understood about the business model of elder care, the more convinced I became that significant changes were not just possible but necessary. Meadowbrook was profitable primarily because it operated with minimal staffing, served low-quality food, and provided just enough activities and services to meet regulatory requirements, without actually enhancing residents' quality of life. A facility run by someone who understood what elderly people actually needed and wanted could be both financially sustainable and genuinely beneficial for its residents. Edward called me 4 weeks after our initial conversation to report that the current owners were indeed interested in selling and that my offer of $3 million had been accepted pending a thorough inspection and due diligence process. The transaction would take approximately 60 days to complete, during which time I would need to secure financing, finalize the legal paperwork, and develop a transition plan for taking over operations. I felt a surge of excitement and nervousness as I realized that I was actually going to become the owner of the facility where I was currently being warehoused against my will. For the first time since Rebecca and Daniel had ambushed me in my kitchen, I felt like I had some control over my circumstances and the power to make decisions that would affect not just my own life, but the lives of everyone else, trapped in this sterile, profit-driven system. The hardest part of the next 2 months was pretending to be a compliant resident, while secretly preparing to become the owner of the entire operation. I continued to participate in the scheduled activities and follow the meal routines, while privately meeting with lawyers, accountants, and business consultants to develop a comprehensive plan for transforming Meadowbrook from a warehouse for elderly people into a place where they could actually thrive. I worked with a consultant who specialized in elder care facilities to develop new policies around visiting hours, meal services, activity programs, and staff training. I researched best practices from facilities around the country that had reputations for genuinely caring about their residents, rather than just managing them efficiently. I planned renovations that would make the common areas more comfortable and the private rooms more personal and dignified. Most importantly, I began developing a new approach to family involvement that would require adult children to demonstrate genuine commitment to their elderly parents, rather than simply dropping them off and disappearing for months at a time. I was particularly interested in implementing policies that would address situations like mine, where families used institutional care as a way to avoid dealing with elderly relatives who were perfectly capable of making their own decisions. The day the sale was finalized, I woke up in my shared room at Meadowbrook for the last time as a resident, and the first time as the owner of the entire facility. Patricia Hendricks had been informed that there would be a change in ownership, but had not been told that the new owner was currently living in room 2 and spending her days being treated like a confused old woman who needed constant supervision. I had asked Edward to schedule the ownership transfer meeting for late afternoon, after the dinner service, but before the evening shift change, when most of the staff would be available to meet their new boss. I spent the morning in my room changing from the comfortable clothes I had been wearing as a resident into the business attire I had asked Eleanor to help me purchase during one of our supervised shopping trips to the nearby mall. When I walked into the administrative conference room wearing a navy blue suit and carrying the leather briefcase Frank had given me when I was promoted to senior bookkeeper, Patricia Hendricks looked confused, then shocked, then vaguely panicked as she realized that one of her residents was sitting down at the head of the conference table with a team of lawyers and accountants. I introduced myself formally as Catherine Wright, the new owner of Meadowbrook Care Facility, and announced that there would be some significant changes in how the facility operated, starting immediately. The first change, I explained, would be a complete revision of the visiting policies, particularly as they related to family members who had used Meadowbrook as a convenient dumping ground for elderly relatives they no longer wanted to deal with. Patricia stammered something about resident files and family contact information, clearly trying to figure out how someone she had classified as a confused elderly woman had managed to purchase the facility where she was being held against her will. I smiled and told her that we would be reviewing every resident's file and family situation to ensure that people were living at Meadowbrook by choice, rather than because their families had made decisions for them without their consent. The meeting lasted 3 hours. As I outlined my vision for transforming Meadowbrook from a profitable warehouse into a place where elderly people could maintain their dignity and autonomy while receiving whatever support they actually needed. I announced immediate increases in staff wages and improvements in food quality, changes in the activity programs to include more meaningful and challenging options, and a complete overhaul of the family visitation policies. Most important, I explained that any family member who had placed a relative at Meadowbrook without their full consent would need to meet with me personally to discuss alternative arrangements, including the possibility of helping their elderly relative return to independent living if that was what they preferred. I made it clear that Meadowbrook would no longer serve as a convenient solution for adult children who wanted to avoid the responsibility of supporting their aging parents. As the staff filed out of the conference room looking stunned but cautiously optimistic about the changes I had announced, I felt a satisfaction deeper than anything I had experienced since Frank's death. I had not only escaped the trap my children had set for me but had positioned myself to help other elderly people avoid similar fates. Tomorrow I would begin the real work of transforming Meadowbrook, but tonight I was going to enjoy the knowledge that I was no longer a victim of other people's decisions about my life. The next morning, I moved out of room 2047 and into the owner's apartment that occupied a corner of the administrative wing, a space that previous owners had used for overnight stays, but that I intended to make my permanent residence. From my new window, I could see the entire facility grounds and watch the comings and goings of staff and families, but more important, I could observe the daily routines and interactions that would help me understand how to make Meadowbrook a place where people like me could live with dignity rather than simply being managed like problems to be solved. The first family meeting I scheduled was with my own children. I scheduled the meeting with Rebecca and Daniel for the following Thursday at 2 in the afternoon, calling each of them separately to inform them that the new management at Meadowbrook needed to discuss my care plan and that their presence was required. Neither of them seemed particularly concerned about the request, though Rebecca did complain about having to take time off work for what she assumed would be another routine administrative meeting about medication schedules or meal preferences. When Thursday arrived, I positioned myself in the main conference room where I had first announced my ownership to the staff, wearing the same navy suit and sitting at the head of the polished table with a stack of folders containing documentation about my purchase of the facility. I had asked Patricia to escort my children to the conference room without providing any advance explanation about the nature of the meeting, wanting to see their genuine reactions when they discovered what had transpired during their absence. Rebecca arrived first, checking her phone constantly and looking impatient as Patricia led her into the conference room. She glanced at me sitting at the head of the table and assumed I had been brought in early for some kind of family consultation, settling into a chair near the middle of the table while continuing to scroll through her email. When Daniel arrived 10 minutes later, he barely acknowledged my presence beyond a perfunctory nod, focusing instead on Patricia as he asked how long this meeting was expected to last since he had a client call scheduled for 3:30. Patricia excused herself from the room with barely concealed amusement, leaving the three of us alone for the first time since the day they had ambushed me in my kitchen and transported me to Meadowbrook against my will. For a long moment, neither of my children seemed to recognize that anything was different about this meeting, both of them sitting with their phones and their impatient expressions while they waited for some staff member to join us and begin the expected discussion about my care. I let the silence stretch until Rebecca finally looked up from her phone and asked when the meeting was going to start, at which point I informed them that the meeting had already begun and that I was the one who had called them here to discuss some significant changes in my living situation. Daniel glanced around the room as if he expected to see a social worker or administrator materializing to take control of the conversation, clearly confused about why I was speaking as if I had any authority over the proceeding. Rebecca was the first to register that something unusual was happening when she noticed the business folders stacked in front of me and the confident way I was sitting at the head of the conference table rather than in the subordinate position she had become accustomed to seeing me occupy. She asked what was going on, her voice carrying the first note of uncertainty I had heard from her since the day she had decided to reorganize my life according to her preference. I opened the top folder and pulled out the official documentation of my purchase of Meadowbrook Care Facility, sliding the papers across the table so both of them could see the transfer of ownership documents with my signature clearly visible at the bottom of each page. I explained calmly that I was no longer a resident of this facility but rather its owner, and that as such I would be implementing some new policies regarding family visitation and involvement in residents' care decisions. The expression on Daniel's face shifted from confusion to disbelief as he picked up the ownership papers and began reading through the legal language that confirmed I had indeed purchased the entire facility for $2 million using funds from the estate Frank and I had accumulated over our decades of careful saving and investing. Rebecca was staring at me with her mouth slightly open, apparently struggling to process the information that her elderly mother had not only escaped their attempt to warehouse her but had actually taken control of the institution where they had tried to imprison her. Daniel was the first to find his voice, demanding to know how I had managed to access that kind of money without his knowledge, since he had assumed he was managing my finances and would be informed of any significant expenditure. I reminded him that he had never been granted power of attorney over my financial affairs, that Frank and I had been careful to maintain our independence and decision-making authority throughout our lives, and that my money had always been mine to spend as I saw fit. Rebecca stood up abruptly and began pacing around the conference room, asking how I could have made such an enormous financial decision without consulting them, especially given that they had gone to considerable trouble to ensure I was living somewhere safe and supervised. Her voice was rising as she spoke, and I could see the anger building as she realized that I had not only rejected their solution to what they perceived as the problem of my aging but had actively undermined their authority over my life in a way that would be difficult for them to reverse. I let them both express their shock and indignation for several minutes before I continued with the real purpose of our meeting, which was to inform them about the new policies I would be implementing regarding family involvement in residents' care decisions. I explained that Meadowbrook would no longer serve as a convenient dumping ground for elderly relatives, whose families preferred not to deal with the complexities of supporting aging parents, that any resident who was capable of making their own decisions would be given the opportunity to reconsider their living arrangement. More specifically, I told them that I would be implementing a new visitation policy that required family members who had placed relatives at Meadowbrook without their full consent to demonstrate ongoing commitment to their elderly family members through regular, meaningful contact. Under the new system, visiting hours would be allocated based on the quality and frequency of family involvement, with priority given to relatives who showed genuine care and concern for their elderly family members' well-being and preference. Daniel interrupted to ask what exactly this meant for their ability to visit me, his tone suggesting that he was beginning to understand that this conversation was not just about facility policies, but about consequences for their treatment of me specifically. I pulled out a calendar from one of my folders and explained that based on their pattern of minimal contact and their decision to place me at Meadowbrook without my consent, they would be allocated visiting hours according to the new family involvement assessment scale I had developed. Rebecca had stopped pacing and was now standing directly across the table from me, her face flushed with anger as she demanded to know if I was actually restricting their ability to see their own mother as some kind of punishment for making responsible decisions about my care. I corrected her characterization of their actions, pointing out that they had made decisions about my life without consulting me, that they had ignored my clearly expressed preferences about where and how I wanted to live, and that they had demonstrated through their subsequent behavior that visiting me was a low priority compared to their other obligations. Under the new policy, I explained, they would each be permitted to visit during designated hours on alternating weekends, with the understanding that these visits were conditional on their demonstrating respect for my autonomy and decision-making capacity. If they wished to increase their visiting privileges, they would need to show evidence of genuine engagement with my well-being, rather than simply checking in occasionally to assuage their guilt about warehousing me in institutional care. Daniel was reading through the visitation policy documents I had provided, his expression growing more strained as he realized that I had created a comprehensive system for evaluating family involvement that would make it impossible for him and Rebecca to continue their pattern of minimal contact while still maintaining the fiction that they were caring children. The policy included specific requirements for advanced scheduling, minimum visit duration, and evidence of meaningful engagement with residents' interests and preferences. Rebecca slammed her hand on the conference table and accused me of being vindictive and manipulative, arguing that I was using my money and my new position of authority to punish them for making difficult decisions about my care that had been motivated by genuine concern for my safety and well-being. She insisted that they had acted in my best interests even if I was too stubborn or confused to recognize their good intentions at the time. I let her finish her defensive speech before I responded by pointing out that if their decisions had truly been motivated by concern for my well-being, they would have involved me in the decision-making process, rather than presenting me with a fait accompli accompanied by strangers with clipboard. I noted that if they had genuinely cared about my safety and happiness, they would have explored alternatives to institutional care that would have allowed me to maintain my independence and dignity. Most importantly, I told them, if they had actually been motivated by love and concern rather than convenience and financial self-interest, they would have maintained regular contact with me after placing me at Meadowbrook instead of visiting sporadically and briefly as if fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. Their pattern of behavior had demonstrated clearly that their primary concern was managing me as a problem rather than supporting me as a person with my own needs and preferences. Daniel tried a different approach, suggesting that perhaps we could work out some kind of compromise that would allow for more flexible visiting arrangements while still maintaining appropriate oversight of my care and living situation. His tone had shifted from demanding to negotiating, and I could see that he was beginning to understand that I held all the power in this situation, and that his options were limited to accepting my terms or having no access to me at all. I informed them that the visiting policy was non-negotiable and had been developed based on careful consideration, what kinds of family relationships actually supported elderly people's well-being versus those that simply managed them as burden. The alternating weekend schedule would give them opportunities to demonstrate whether they were capable of engaging with me as an autonomous person, deserving of respect rather than as a confused old woman whose opinions could be safely ignored. Rebecca asked what would happen if they refused to accept these restrictions on their visits, her voice carrying a note of desperation, as she realized that I had effectively reversed our power dynamic in a way that left them with very little leverage. I explained that they were certainly free to choose not to visit at all, but that if they wished to maintain any relationship with me, it would be on terms that acknowledged my autonomy and respected my capacity to make decisions about my own life. The conversation continued for another hour as my children cycled through various strategies for trying to regain control of the situation, from attempting to guilt me about the financial risk I had taken to suggesting that my purchase of Meadowbrook was evidence of impaired judgment that might require legal intervention. I addressed each of their concerns calmly and factually, pointing out that I had worked with qualified professionals throughout the acquisition process, and that my decision had been based on careful analysis of both my financial situation and my long-term care needs. Eventually, Daniel asked what I actually wanted from them, whether there was some way they could demonstrate the kind of family involvement that would earn them more flexible visiting privileges. I could hear in his voice that he was beginning to understand that this was not just about punishing for their past behavior but about establishing a new foundation for our relationship that would be based on mutual respect rather than their assumption that they had the right to make decisions about my life without my input. I explained that what I wanted was very simple. I wanted them to treat me like a competent adult whose opinions and preferences mattered, to engage with me as a person with my own interests and goals rather than as a problem to be managed, and to demonstrate through their actions that they valued our relationship enough to prioritize it over their other obligations. If they could do those things consistently over time, we could discuss adjusting the visiting schedule to allow for more frequent contact. Rebecca was still clearly angry about the reversal of our power dynamic, but I could see that she was also beginning to calculate whether it would be worth swallowing her pride in order to maintain access to me and, more importantly, to whatever inheritance she might be expecting from my estate. Daniel was more obviously distressed by the situation, probably realizing that his minimal involvement in my life over the past several years had not prepared him for having to demonstrate genuine care and engagement in order to preserve our relationship. As the meeting concluded, I provided them each with a copy of the new visitation policy along with a schedule showing their allocated visiting times for the next 3 months. I explained that their compliance with the policy would be monitored, and that any violations, including attempts to visit outside their designated hours or efforts to circumvent the new rules, would result in further restrictions on their access to the facility. I also informed them that I would be reviewing the cases of other residents whose families had placed them at Meadowbrook under similar circumstances, and that I would be implementing facility-wide changes designed to ensure that elderly people maintained control over their living situations and care decisions whenever possible. My goal was to transform Meadowbrook from a warehouse for inconvenient elderly relatives into a place where people could receive support while maintaining their dignity and autonomy. When they left the conference room, both of my children looked shell-shocked by the conversation and the dramatic shift in our family dynamic. Rebecca was muttering angrily about legal options and the unfairness of my new policies, while Daniel seemed more focused on trying to understand how he could adapt to the new requirements in order to maintain some kind of relationship with me. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the work of transforming Meadowbrook according to my vision for what elder care could look like when it was designed around the needs and preferences of elderly people rather than the convenience of their family. I hired additional staff members and increased wages across the board, improved the quality of food service by contracting with local suppliers who could provide fresh, flavorful meals rather than institutional fit, and expanded the activity programs to include options that challenged residents intellectually and creatively rather than simply keeping them occupied. Most importantly, I began conducting individual meetings with every resident to assess their satisfaction with their living situation, and to explore whether they were at Meadowbrook by choice or because their families had made decisions for them without adequate consultation. I was not surprised to discover that more than half of the residents had stories similar to mine, involving family members who had used health scares or minor incidents as justification for forcing elderly relatives into institutional care against their expressed preference. Eleanor, my former roommate and fellow victim of family decision-making, was among the first residents I approached about potentially returning to independent living with appropriate support services. Her daughter had sold Eleanor's apartment and belongings immediately after moving her to Meadowbrook, but Eleanor still had sufficient financial resources to establish a new independent living situation if she chose to do so. I arranged for her to work with a social worker who specialized in helping elderly people transition back to community living, and within 6 weeks, Eleanor had moved into a senior apartment complex where she could maintain her independence while having access to assistance if needed. Margaret, the retired teacher whose son had moved her across multiple states to place her at Meadowbrook, required more complex arrangements since her social connections and familiar environment were so far away. However, Margaret had taught school in 3 different states during her career and was interested in relocating to a community near her former colleagues in North Carolina. I helped her connect with a relocation specialist who could assist with finding appropriate housing and support services in her preferred area, and Margaret began making plans to leave Meadowbrook within the next few months. As word spread about the changes I was implementing at Meadowbrook, I began receiving inquiries from elderly people in similar situations who were seeking alternatives to traditional institutional care. I realized that there was significant demand for a different model of elder care that prioritized resident autonomy and family accountability, and I began developing plans to expand the concept to additional facilities in other locations. The first test of my new visitation policy came 3 weeks after my meeting with Rebecca and Daniel, when Rebecca showed up on a Wednesday afternoon, demanding to see me outside of her scheduled weekend visiting hour. The front desk staff, who had been thoroughly trained on the new policies, politely informed her that she was not authorized for visits during the week, and offered to schedule an appointment during her next allocated time slot. Rebecca became increasingly agitated when the staff refused to make an exception to the policy, eventually demanding to speak with the facility director and threatening to call the state regulatory agency to file a complaint about the visiting restrictions. Patricia Hendrick, who had adapted quickly to the new management structure, calmly explained that the visiting policies had been developed in consultation with elder care specialists, and were designed to ensure that family relationships supported residents' well-being rather than simply providing convenience for relatives. When Rebecca insisted that the restrictions were punitive and unreasonable, Patricia offered to arrange a meeting with me during regular business hours to discuss her concerns about the policy, but made it clear that no exceptions would be made to the established visiting schedule. Rebecca left the facility angry and frustrated, but the staff had successfully enforced the new rules without creating a confrontation that might have undermined the policy's effectiveness. Daniel handled his first scheduled visit more successfully, arriving promptly during his designated Saturday afternoon time slot, and spending 2 full hours engaging with me in meaningful conversation about topics beyond my medical care and facility services. He asked about my plans for Meadowbrook, showed genuine interest in my perspective on the changes I was implementing, and even admitted that he had not fully considered my feelings and preferences when he and Rebecca had decided to move me to institutional care. I could see that Daniel was making a genuine effort to demonstrate the kind of family involvement that the new policy was designed to encourage, and I appreciated his willingness to acknowledge that their approach to managing my aging had been flawed. We talked about his work and his family in more depth than we had in years, and for the first time since Frank's death, I felt like Daniel was actually seeing me as a person rather than as a problem requiring management. The contrast between Rebecca's angry resistance to the new boundaries and Daniel's tentative efforts to adapt to them was instructive in terms of understanding how the visiting policy might affect different types of family relationships. Rebecca's response suggested that her primary concern was maintaining control and convenience rather than actually improving our relationship, while Daniel seemed genuinely interested in finding a way to connect with me that respected my autonomy and decision-making capacity. Over the next month, I continued to refine the visiting policies, based on observations of how different families responded to the new requirement. Some relatives like Daniel seemed to understand that the restrictions were designed to encourage more meaningful engagement, and made genuine efforts to demonstrate their commitment to their elderly family member. Others like Rebecca viewed the policies as unreasonable impediments to their convenience, and continued to push for exceptions and modification. I also began documenting the positive changes that were occurring throughout Meadowbrook as a result of the facility-wide improvements I had implemented. Residents were more engaged and active, staff morale had improved significantly due to better wages and working conditions, and the overall atmosphere of the facility had shifted from institutional warehousing to genuine care and support for elderly people maintaining their dignity and autonomy. The regulatory inspection that occurred 2 months after I took ownership of Meadowbrook resulted in the highest ratings the facility had ever received, with particular praise for the innovative approaches to family involvement and resident empowerment that I had developed. The inspector noted that the facility had achieved an unusual balance between providing necessary support services and maintaining respect for residents' independence and decision-making capacity. As I sat in my owner's apartment one evening reviewing the progress reports and feedback from residents and families, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since the morning when Rebecca and Daniel had ambushed me in my kitchen with their plans to warehouse me in institutional care. I had not only escaped their attempt to control my life, but had positioned myself to help other elderly people avoid similar fates, while creating a sustainable business model that proved elder care could be both profitable and humane. The next phase of my plan would involve expanding the Meadowbrook model to additional locations, but I was also interested in developing advocacy programs that could help elderly people and their families navigate the complex decisions around aging and care needs, without resorting to the kind of coercive measures that my children had attempted to use against me. I wanted to create resources that would support family relationships based on mutual respect, rather than the assumption that aging automatically meant losing the right to make decisions about one's own life. Most importantly, I was discovering that taking control of my own situation had given me a sense of purpose and energy that I had not experienced since Frank's death. I was no longer simply surviving the indignities of institutional care or waiting for my children to decide what my life should look like. I was actively creating the kind of environment where elderly people could thrive, and I was demonstrating that age did not automatically disqualify someone from making bold decisions and taking significant risks in pursuit of a better life. The upcoming weekend would bring Rebecca's second scheduled visit under the new policy, and I was curious to see whether she had used the intervening time to reconsider her approach to our relationship, or whether she would continue to resist the boundaries I had established. Either way, I was confident that I had created a system that would protect my autonomy while providing my children with opportunities to demonstrate whether they were capable of treating me with the respect and consideration that any person deserved, regardless of their age. Rebecca's second visit arrived on a humid Saturday morning in late June, and I positioned myself in the main lobby to observe how she would handle the check-in process under the new system. I had instructed the front desk staff to follow the protocols exactly as written, with no exceptions or accommodations that might undermine the consistency of the policy enforcement. From my vantage point near the administrative offices, I could see Rebecca approaching the reception desk with the same impatient expression she had worn during our confrontational meeting in the conference room. The young woman at the front desk, Maria, greeted Rebecca professionally and asked for identification before consulting the visitor scheduling system to confirm her appointment. I watched Rebecca's jaw tighten as she was required to sign in formally and receive a visitor badge, procedures that had never been necessary during her previous sporadic visits when she could simply walk through the facility without any accountability for her time or behavior. Maria handed Rebecca a printed sheet outlining the expectations for family visits, including guidelines about respectful interaction with residents and staff, appropriate topics of conversation, and the minimum 2-hour duration required for visits to count toward family involvement assessment. Rebecca glanced at the paper with obvious irritation before asking where she could find me, clearly expecting to be directed to my old room where she could conduct another brief perfunctory visit focused on assuaging her guilt rather than meaningful engagement. When Maria explained that I would be meeting with Rebecca in the family conference room rather than in my private apartment, Rebecca's expression shifted to confusion and then annoyance as she realized that even the location of our visit was being controlled according to policies she had no power to negotiate or modify. She followed Maria down the hallway toward the designated meeting space, her posture stiff with resentment about having to adapt to procedures that treated her like any other visitor rather than like someone with special privileges. I arrived at the conference room a few minutes after Rebecca, carrying a folder of documents related to facility improvements and a notebook where I had been tracking the progress of residents who were transitioning back to independent living with support service. Rebecca was already seated at the table, checking her phone and looking like she was calculating how quickly she could fulfill the minimum time required requirement and escape back to her regular weekend activity. When I entered the room, Rebecca looked up with an expression that mixed defiance with uncertainty, clearly unsure about how to navigate this new dynamic where I controlled the terms of our interaction rather than simply enduring whatever level of attention she chose to provide. She asked how long this visit was expected to last, her tone suggesting that she viewed the 2-hour minimum as an unreasonable burden on her valuable time. I sat down across from her and explained that the length of our visit would depend on her willingness to engage in meaningful conversation about topics beyond my medical status and facility service. If she was genuinely interested in understanding my new role at Meadowbrook and my plans for expanding the innovative elder care model I was developing, we could easily spend several hours discussing subjects that would be mutually interesting and beneficial. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair and asked what I meant by meaningful conversation, apparently struggling to imagine what we might discuss that would require more than the routine check-ins she had been conducting during her previous visit. I opened my folder and pulled out some photographs of the facility improvements I had been implementing, explaining that I wanted to share my vision for transforming elder care and get her perspective on the challenges facing elderly people and their families. For the first time since she had arrived, Rebecca looked genuinely surprised by the direction of our conversation. She examined the photographs showing the renovated common areas, the expanded library and computer center, and the new gardens where residents could grow vegetables and flowers according to their personal preference. I explained that these changes were part of a comprehensive approach to creating environments where elderly people could maintain their sense of purpose and identity rather than simply being managed as patients requiring supervision. Rebecca asked how much these improvements were costing and whether I was concerned about the financial sustainability of operating a facility with higher standards and staffing levels than the typical elder care institution. I could hear in her question both genuine curiosity and underlying anxiety about how my spending on Meadowbrook might affect whatever inheritance she was expecting from my estate. I explained that the facility improvements were being funded through a combination of operating revenue and strategic investments from my personal resources, and that the higher quality of care and services was actually attracting residents who were willing to pay premium rates for an environment that respected their autonomy and dignity. The waiting list for admission to Meadowbrook had grown significantly since I had implemented the new policies, with families specifically seeking alternatives to traditional institutional care. More importantly, I told Rebecca, the financial success of the Meadowbrook model was proving that elder care could be both profitable and humane when it was designed around the actual needs and preferences of elderly people rather than the convenience of families and staff. I was documenting the operational strategies and outcomes with the goal of eventually franchising the concept to other locations where similar improvements could benefit more elderly people. Rebecca seemed genuinely engaged with this information for the first time during any of our recent interactions, asking detailed questions about the business model and the regulatory challenges involved in operating an elder care facility. I realized that discussing my work as a business owner and innovator was allowing us to connect as equals in a way that had not been possible when she viewed me primarily as an aging parent requiring management. As our conversation continued, I began sharing some of the individual success stories from residents who had been able to transition back to independent living or who had found new sources of meaning and engagement within the facility. I told her about Eleanor's successful move to the senior apartment complex, about Margaret's plans to relocate near her former teaching colleagues, and about several other residents who had discovered that they had more options and autonomy than their families had led them to believe. Rebecca listened to these stories with increasing attention, occasionally asking questions that suggested she was beginning to understand that my purchase of Meadowbrook had been motivated by more than just escaping the situation she and Daniel had created. She seemed to recognize that I had identified a genuine problem with how society treats elderly people and had developed a practical solution that was benefiting not just me but dozens of other residents and their families. When I mentioned that I was planning to document the Meadowbrook model and potentially expand it to other locations, Rebecca asked whether I would need assistance with the business development and marketing aspects of such an expansion. Her question surprised me because it was the first time she had ever shown interest in my work or suggested that my skills and experience might be valuable rather than simply outdated remnants of an earlier generation. I explained that I was indeed planning to hire consultants and staff members who could help with expanding the concept, but that I would need people who genuinely understood and supported the philosophy behind the Meadowbrook model rather than simply viewing it as another business opportunity. The expansion would require individuals who were committed to transforming elder care rather than just replicating successful operational strategies. Rebecca asked what kinds of qualifications and experience would be most valuable for someone interested in working on the expansion project, and I could see that she was beginning to consider whether this might represent an opportunity for her to become involved in my work in a meaningful way. Her career in marketing and business development could potentially be relevant to the challenges of scaling the Meadowbrook model, but only if she could demonstrate genuine commitment to the underlying values and goals. I told her that the most important qualification would be a deep understanding of the dignity and autonomy that elderly people deserved, along with the creativity and persistence necessary to challenge existing assumptions about elder care. Anyone working on the expansion would need to be willing to prioritize resident well-being over profit margins and to advocate for elderly people's rights even when families or regulatory agencies preferred more convenient solutions. For the next hour, we discussed the specific challenges involved in creating elder care environments that balanced safety and support with independence and choice. Rebecca showed more genuine engagement with these topics than she had demonstrated during any of our previous conversations, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights based on her professional experience with organizational change and consumer behavior. As our visit continued well beyond the required 2-hour minimum, I began to see glimpses of the intelligent, capable woman Rebecca had become in her professional life. Qualities that had been obscured during our recent interactions by her defensive reactions to my resistance to her plans for managing my aging. When she was discussing business strategies and implementation challenges, she was confident and articulate in ways that reminded me of the ambitious young woman who had graduated from college and launched her career with such determination. Near the end of our visit, Rebecca asked directly whether I would consider allowing her to become involved in the expansion project, acknowledging that her previous approach to our relationship had been based on assumptions about aging and family responsibilities that she was beginning to question. She admitted that she had not fully considered my perspective when she and Daniel had decided to move me to institutional care, and that seeing the success of my work at Meadowbrook was helping her understand how much she had underestimated my capabilities and judgment. I told her that I would be willing to discuss her potential involvement in the expansion project, but that any such arrangement would need to be based on a fundamentally different understanding of our relationship than the one that had led to their decision to warehouse me at Meadowbrook against my will. She would need to demonstrate through her actions that she respected my autonomy and decision-making capacity, and that she was genuinely committed to the goals of the project rather than simply seeking access to a profitable business opportunity. More specifically, I explained that her continued participation in the family visiting program would serve as a test of her ability to maintain respectful, supportive relationships with elderly people under circumstances that required patience and consistency rather than the quick resolution of perceived problems. If she could successfully navigate the visiting requirements and demonstrate genuine engagement with my interests and goals, we could explore possibilities for professional collaboration. Rebecca agreed to these conditions with more enthusiasm than I had expected, and for the first time since I had implemented the new visiting policies, I felt optimistic about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect rather than her assumption that my aging automatically diminished my competence and autonomy. Our visit lasted nearly 4 hours, the longest meaningful conversation we had shared since she was a teenager discussing her college plans and career aspirations. The following week brought a surprise visit from my granddaughter Jessica, Rebecca's 24-year-old daughter who had recently graduated from social work school and was working at a nonprofit organization focused on elder advocacy. Jessica had apparently heard about the changes at Meadowbrook from her mother and was curious to learn more about my work transforming the facility and developing new models for elder care. Jessica's visit was not part of the formal family visiting schedule since she had not been involved in the decision to place me at Meadowbrook, but I was pleased to meet with her in my apartment to discuss her career interests and my observations about the challenges facing elderly people in institutional care setting. She brought with her a detailed list of questions about resident empowerment strategies and family accountability measures, suggesting that she had done considerable research before requesting the meeting. As we talked, I learned that Jessica had chosen social work specifically because of her interest in elder advocacy and her concern about how society treats aging adults. She had completed internships at several elder care facilities and had been troubled by the institutional approaches that prioritized efficiency and cost control over resident autonomy and dignity. Her academic research had focused on alternative models of elder care that maintained community connections and individual choice. Jessica was particularly interested in the visiting policies I had developed and their potential application in other elder care settings. She understood immediately that the restrictions on family contact were not punitive measures, but rather accountability systems designed to ensure that elderly people received genuine support rather than perfunctory management from their relatives. She asked thoughtful questions about implementation challenges and measurement strategies that demonstrated both professional knowledge and personal insight. I found myself energized by Jessica's genuine understanding of the problems I was trying to address and her thoughtful questions about potential solutions. Unlike her mother's initial resistance to the visiting policies, Jessica recognized immediately that accountability measures were necessary to protect elderly people from family members who might prefer convenience over genuine care and support. When Jessica asked whether I would be interested in having her conduct a formal evaluation of the Meadowbrook model for potential publication in social work journals, I realized that she could provide exactly the kind of professional validation and documentation that would be necessary for expanding the concept to other locations. Her training in research methodology and her understanding of elder care issues would allow her to assess the facility's innovations objectively and identify best practices that could be replicated elsewhere. Over the following month, Jessica conducted extensive interviews with residents, staff members, and family visitors to document the impacts of the policy changes I had implemented at Meadowbrook. Her research revealed significant improvements in resident satisfaction, staff morale, and family relationship quality compared to baseline measurements from before my ownership of the facility. Most importantly, Jessica's research demonstrated that the visiting policies had succeeded in encouraging more meaningful family engagement, while protecting residents from relatives who were primarily interested in managing elderly people as problems rather than supporting them as autonomous individuals. The families who had adapted successfully to the new requirements reported improved relationships with their elderly relatives, while those who had resisted the policies had generally demonstrated patterns of behavior that were not beneficial for resident well-being. Jessica's preliminary findings attracted attention from elder care researchers at the State University, who invited me to present the Meadowbrook model at an upcoming conference on innovative approaches to aging services. The presentation would provide an opportunity to share the strategies I had developed with professionals from across the region, and to gather feedback about potential improvements and expansion possibilities. Preparing for the conference presentation required me to articulate clearly the philosophical foundations underlying the practical changes I had implemented at Meadowbrook. I spent several weeks developing materials that explained how the facility's policies reflected broader principles about dignity, autonomy, and the rights of elderly people to make decisions about their own lives even when those decisions might seem inconvenient or challenging for their family. The conference presentation was attended by more than 200 elder care professionals, including facility administrators, social workers, geriatricians, and policy researchers from throughout the state. I had been nervous about speaking to such a large professional audience, but once I began describing the problems I had observed at Meadowbrook and the solutions I had developed, I found myself speaking with confidence and passion about the potential for transforming elder care. The response to my presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with numerous audience members approaching me afterward to discuss implementation strategies for their own facilities and programs. Several administrators expressed interest in piloting similar visiting policies and resident empowerment measures, while researchers requested permission to study the Meadowbrook model in greater detail for potential replication and expansion. Most significantly, I received an invitation from a group of investors who were interested in funding the development of additional facilities based on the Meadowbrook model. The investors had been looking for opportunities to support innovative approaches to elder care that could demonstrate both social impact and financial sustainability, and they saw the documented success at Meadowbrook as evidence that such a combination was achievable. The possibility of expanding the Meadowbrook model to multiple locations represented an opportunity to help thousands of elderly people maintain their dignity and autonomy while receiving appropriate support and care. However, it also presented complex challenges related to maintaining quality standards, training staff members, and ensuring that the underlying philosophy of resident empowerment was preserved as the concept scaled to larger operations. As I considered the expansion opportunity, I realized that I would need to assemble a team of professionals who shared my commitment to transforming elder care, rather than simply replicating successful business models. The team would need to include individuals with expertise in facility operations, staff training, regulatory compliance, and family counseling, all working together to maintain the values and standards that had made Meadowbrook successful. Rebecca's interest in becoming involved in the expansion project suddenly seemed much more relevant and potentially valuable. Her business development experience could be crucial for managing the growth process, but more important, her recent evolution in understanding elder care issues suggested that she might be genuinely committed to the project's underlying goals, rather than simply seeking a profitable business opportunity. Daniel's next scheduled visit provided an opportunity to discuss the expansion possibilities and to assess whether he might also be interested in becoming involved in the project in some capacity. His background in project management and his growing understanding of the visiting policy requirements suggested that he might be able to contribute to the operational aspects of developing new facilities. When Daniel arrived for his visit, I was surprised to see that he had brought his teenage son Marcus with him, explaining that Marcus had been asking questions about my work at Meadowbrook and was interested in learning more about career opportunities in elder care and social services. Marcus was a thoughtful, articulate young man who asked insightful questions about the challenges facing elderly people and the potential for innovative solutions. As we talked, Marcus mentioned that he had been volunteering at a local senior center and had been troubled by the way some families seemed to view their elderly relatives as burdens, rather than as people deserving of respect and support. His observations echoed many of the concerns that had motivated my own work at Meadowbrook, and I was impressed by his maturity and empathy in discussing these sensitive issues. The conversation with Daniel and Marcus lasted the entire afternoon, covering topics ranging from the operational details of running an elder care facility to the broader social and policy issues affecting elderly people and their families. Daniel seemed genuinely engaged with the discussion and asked several thoughtful questions about the potential challenges and opportunities involved in expanding the Meadowbrook model. Near the end of their visit, Daniel asked whether I would consider allowing him to visit more frequently so that he could learn more about the facility's operations and potentially contribute to the expansion planning process. His request represented a significant shift from his previous pattern of minimal, obligatory contact, and I was encouraged by his apparent genuine interest in becoming more involved in my work and my life. I explained that increased visiting privileges would need to be earned through consistent demonstration of the kind of family involvement that the visiting policies were designed to encourage, but that I would be willing to consider adjustments to his schedule based on his performance under the current requirements. More importantly, any professional involvement in the expansion project would need to be based on his demonstrated commitment to the underlying values and goals rather than simply on family relationships. Over the following weeks, both Rebecca and Daniel began visiting more frequently and engaging more meaningfully with my work at Meadowbrook. Rebecca attended several staff meetings and contributed valuable insights about marketing strategies and organizational development, while Daniel shadowed facility administrators and learned about the operational challenges involved in maintaining high standards of care while managing costs and regulatory requirements. Most importantly, both of my children seemed to be developing a genuine understanding of the dignity and autonomy that elderly people deserved, moving beyond their previous assumptions that aging automatically diminished competence and decision-making capacity. Their evolution in understanding these issues was encouraging not just for our family relationships, but also for their potential contributions to expanding the Meadowbrook model. The transformation in my relationships with Rebecca and Daniel was more profound than I had expected when I first implemented the visiting policies. By requiring them to demonstrate genuine engagement and respect rather than simply fulfilling obligatory family duties, the policies had created opportunities for us to connect as equals working toward shared goals rather than as a burdensome elderly parent and her dutiful but resentful children. As autumn approached, I began finalizing plans for the first expansion facility, which would be located in a neighboring county and would serve as a pilot site for refining the Meadowbrook model before broader implementation. The expansion would provide opportunities to test the scalability of the policies and procedures I had developed while creating additional options for elderly people seeking alternatives to traditional institutional care. The success of the Meadowbrook transformation had exceeded my most optimistic expectations, not just in terms of resident satisfaction and facility operations, but also in terms of the personal relationships and professional opportunities that had emerged from my decision to take control of my own circumstances rather than accepting the limitations that others had tried to impose on my life. The first major challenge to my authority at Meadowbrook came from an unexpected source when Rebecca's ex-husband Thomas arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, demanding access to the facility records and threatening legal action if I refused to cooperate with what he claimed was a family intervention regarding my financial decision-making. Thomas had never shown any interest in my well-being during the 12 years he was married to Rebecca, but apparently my purchase of Meadowbrook had caught his attention as a potential threat to whatever assets he might be hoping to claim in ongoing divorce proceedings. I was in my office reviewing architectural plans for the expansion facility when Patricia knocked on my door to inform me that Thomas was in the lobby, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit who had identified himself as a lawyer specializing in elder law and conservatorship proceedings. My first instinct was to refuse the meeting entirely, but I realized that confronting this challenge directly would be more effective than allowing Thomas to build a case based on claims that I was avoiding reasonable inquiries about my competence and judgment. When I entered the lobby, Thomas was standing near the reception desk with his arms crossed, wearing the same aggressive posture he had used during family gatherings when he disagreed with decisions that didn't benefit him directly. The lawyer beside him was a thin, nervous-looking man who kept glancing around the facility as if he was calculating its value and trying to understand how an elderly woman had managed to acquire such a substantial asset. Thomas greeted me with false concern, asking how I was adjusting to my new living situation and whether I was receiving adequate medical supervision and support services. His tone carried the patronizing quality that he had always used when speaking to women he considered intellectually inferior, but I could hear the underlying calculation as he tried to establish a record of family concern that might support legal challenges to my autonomy. I responded calmly that I was not living at Meadowbrook as a resident, but rather as the owner and administrator, and that my living situation was entirely satisfactory since I had designed it according to my own preferences and requirements. Thomas looked confused by this information, apparently unaware that I had purchased the facility rather than simply being relocated there by Rebecca and Daniel. The lawyer stepped forward and introduced himself as Mitchell Davidson, explaining that he represented Thomas in matters related to family estate planning and elder care oversight. He asked whether I would be willing to discuss my recent financial decisions with him so that the family could better understand my long-term care planning and ensure that appropriate safeguards were in place to protect my interests. I informed Mr. Davidson that my financial affairs were managed by my own legal counsel and that I had no obligation to discuss my decisions with anyone who was not directly involved in my care or business operation. I noted that Thomas had never been involved in my financial planning during his marriage to Rebecca and had no standing to request information about my estate or my business investment. Thomas interrupted to say that he was concerned about my capacity to manage such a large financial transaction without without proper oversight, suggesting that elderly people were often vulnerable to exploitation by unscrupulous business partners or caregivers who might take advantage of cognitive decline or emotional vulnerability. His implication was clear. He believed that my purchase of Meadowbrook was evidence of impaired judgment rather than strategic decision-making. Davidson added that families had both legal rights and moral obligations to ensure that elderly relatives were protected from financial abuse or poor decision-making that might jeopardize their long-term security. He suggested that a formal competency evaluation might be helpful for establishing that my recent decisions had been made with full understanding of their implications and consequences. I listened to their arguments without interruption, then informed them that I had anticipated such challenges and had already arranged for comprehensive evaluations by qualified professionals to document my mental capacity and decision-making competence. The evaluations, conducted by geriatricians and neuropsychologists recommended by my attorney, had confirmed that I was fully capable of managing my own affairs and making complex business decisions. More importantly, I explained that my purchase of Meadowbrook had been structured with extensive legal and financial oversight, including due diligence reviews by qualified professionals and ongoing monitoring by regulatory agencies responsible for elder care facility operations. The transaction had been transparent and thoroughly documented, with multiple layers of protection against the kinds of exploitation that Mr. Davidson was suggesting might have occurred. Thomas demanded to see the competency evaluations and financial documentation, claiming that the family had a right to review any materials that might affect their understanding of my long-term care needs and estate plan. I declined to provide this information, noting that Thomas had no legal standing to request private medical or financial records and that his sudden interest in my welfare seemed suspiciously related to his own financial difficulties, rather than genuine concern for my well-being. Davidson threatened to file court papers seeking emergency conservatorship if I refused to cooperate with reasonable requests for information about my mental capacity and financial decision-making. He suggested that my refusal to submit to family oversight was itself evidence of impaired judgment and that the court would likely order comprehensive valuations and asset protection measures if presented with evidence of questionable financial transactions. I stood up and informed both men that this conversation was concluded and that any future communication regarding my personal affairs should be directed through my attorney. I had Patricia escort them from the building while I returned to my office to call Edward Morrison and alert him to the potential legal challenges that Thomas might attempt to pursue. Edward was not surprised by Thomas's intervention, explaining that family members often emerged from the shadows when elderly relatives made significant financial decisions that might affect inheritance expectations. He assured me that the comprehensive documentation we had assembled regarding my competency and the legitimacy of the Meadowbrook purchase would provide strong protection against conservatorship attempts, but he recommended that we prepare for more aggressive legal challenges in the coming week. The encounter with Thomas reinforced my understanding that taking control of my own circumstances would continue to generate resistance from people who preferred elderly individuals to remain passive and dependent, rather than assertive and independent. However, it also reminded me that I had the resources and support necessary to defend my autonomy against such challenges and that my success at Meadowbrook was providing a powerful demonstration of my continued competence and judgment. The next morning brought news that Thomas had indeed filed preliminary paperwork seeking emergency conservatorship, claiming that my purchase of Meadowbrook represented a significant departure from my previous financial behavior and that my family was concerned about my vulnerability to exploitation by individuals who might be taking advantage of cognitive decline or emotional instability. The filing included affidavits from Rebecca and Daniel describing their concerns about my decision-making and their belief that professional oversight of my finances might be necessary. I was initially angry that my children had allowed Thomas to use their names in legal proceedings against me, but Edward explained that their cooperation with his filing might actually be beneficial for our defense strategy. If Rebecca and Daniel were the primary sources of concern about my competency, their recent evolution in understanding and supporting my work at Meadowbrook could serve as powerful evidence that their initial concerns had been unfounded. More important, the months of documented interactions under the new visiting policies had created a clear record of my consistent mental capacity and decision-making ability, while also demonstrating that my children's initial resistance to my autonomy had been based on their own assumptions and preferences rather than objective assessment of my capability. Edward immediately filed a response challenging the conservatorship petition and requesting an expedited hearing so that the matter could be resolved quickly without disrupting the facility operations or my ongoing expansion planning. He also arranged for updated competency evaluations by additional qualified professionals who could provide independent assessments of my mental capacity and business judgment. The legal challenge created an opportunity to demonstrate publicly that elderly people could successfully resist family attempts to control their autonomy, but it also required me to divert significant time and energy from my work at Meadowbrook toward defending my right to make my own decisions. I was determined not to allow Thomas's manipulative tactics to undermine either my personal independence or my professional goals. Rebecca called me the day after the conservatorship papers were filed, sounding distressed and apologetic about her involvement in Thomas's legal strategy. She explained that he had pressured her to sign the affidavit by claiming that it was necessary to protect me from potential financial exploitation, and that she had not understood the full implications of the legal action until after the papers were filed. I told Rebecca that her participation in Thomas's attempt to have me declared incompetent represented exactly the kind of family behavior that the visiting policies were designed to address, and that her willingness to question my judgment based on his manipulation demonstrated that she still had significant work to do in learning to respect my autonomy and decision-making capacity. Rebecca asked whether there was anything she could do to correct the situation, acknowledging that she had made a serious error in allowing Thomas to involve her in legal proceedings against me. I explained that she could help by providing honest testimony about the improvements in our relationship since I had implemented the visiting policies and about her growing understanding of my competence and business judgment through her involvement in the expansion plan. More importantly, I told her that this situation was a test of whether she was genuinely committed to supporting my autonomy or whether she would continue to allow other people to manipulate her into undermining my independence whenever it seemed convenient or beneficial for them. Her response to this challenge would determine whether our relationship could continue to develop positively or whether the visiting restrictions would need to be reinstated to protect me from further family interference. Daniel's response to the conservatorship filing was more immediately supportive, as he called to express his opposition to Thomas's legal action and his willingness to testify on my behalf regarding my competence and business judgment. He had apparently refused to sign Thomas's affidavit from the beginning, recognizing that my success at Meadowbrook provided clear evidence of my continued mental capacity and decision-making ability. Daniel offered to provide detailed documentation of his observations during his recent visits, including his assessments of my business planning, staff management, and strategic thinking related to the expansion project. He also volunteered to serve as a character witness regarding my consistency and rationality in personal interactions and family relationships. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, providing enough time for comprehensive preparation while minimizing the disruption to facility operations and resident care. Edward assembled a team of expert witnesses, including the geriatricians and neuropsychologists who had evaluated my competency, business consultants who had reviewed the Meadowbrook acquisition, and elder care professionals who could testify about the success of the policies and programs I had implemented. Jessica volunteered to present her research findings about the positive impacts of the Meadowbrook model on resident well-being and family relationships, providing objective evidence that my leadership of the facility had been beneficial rather than harmful. Her academic credentials and professional expertise in elder care would give additional weight to testimony about my competence and judgment. Patricia Hendricks offered to testify about my day-to-day management of facility operations, staff supervision, and strategic planning, providing detailed evidence of my involvement in complex decision-making and problem-solving activities that would be impossible for someone with cognitive impairment or poor judgment. The facility's improved regulatory ratings and financial performance under my ownership provided objective measures of my business competence. Most significantly, Several residents volunteered to testify about the improvements in their quality of life since I had taken ownership of Meadowbrook, providing personal accounts of how my policies and programs had enhanced their autonomy and dignity rather than exploiting their vulnerability. Eleanor and Margaret were particularly eager to describe how my support had enabled them to transition back to independent living despite their family's initial resistance. As the hearing date approached, I felt confident that we had assembled overwhelming evidence of my mental capacity and business competence, but I also understood that the outcome would have implications beyond my personal situation. A successful defense against the conservatorship attempt would demonstrate that elderly people could resist family manipulation and maintain their independence even when faced with coordinated legal challenges. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the hearing, with representatives from elder advocacy organizations, other family members facing similar challenges, and professional colleagues who had learned about the case through the conference presentation and media coverage of the Meadowbrook mob. The attention was somewhat overwhelming, but I recognized that the visibility might help other elderly people who were facing similar attempts by family members to control their autonomy. Thomas appeared confident as the petitioner, clearly expecting that the court would view his concerns about my financial decision-making as reasonable family oversight rather than manipulative interference. Davidson presented their case as a straightforward matter of protecting an elderly woman from poor judgment and potential exploitation, focusing on the unusual nature of my decision to purchase an elder care facility and my resistance to family involvement in financial planning. Edward's presentation of our defense was systematic and comprehensive, beginning with the competence evaluations that demonstrated my intact cognitive function, and progressing through detailed documentation of my business planning, facility management, and strategic decision-making. The expert witnesses provided clear professional assessments of my mental capacity and business judgment that left little room for doubt about my competence. Rebecca's testimony was particularly powerful as she described her evolution from initial concern about my decision-making to recognition that her doubts had been based on ageist assumptions rather than objective assessment of my capability. She acknowledged that her participation in Thomas's legal action had been a mistake and provided detailed examples of my competent handling of complex business and family decisions. Daniel's testimony reinforced Rebecca's account while providing additional evidence of my consistency and rationality in personal interactions and professional activity. His descriptions of our recent conversations about expansion planning and facility operations demonstrated my engagement with complex, forward-thinking projects that would be impossible for someone with cognitive impairment. Jessica's presentation of her research findings provided objective, academic evidence that my leadership of Meadowbrook had produced measurable improvements in resident satisfaction, staff performance, and family relationships. Her professional credentials and research methodology gave scientific weight to testimony about my positive impact on the facility and its community. The resident testimonies were the most emotionally compelling part of the hearing, as Eleanor, Margaret, and several other residents described how my policies and programs had restored their sense of dignity and autonomy after periods of feeling warehoused and forgotten by their family. Their accounts provided powerful evidence that my decision-making had been beneficial rather than harmful to the vulnerable elderly people in my care. Patricia's testimony about daily facility operations provided detailed evidence of my involvement in staff supervision, regulatory compliance, financial management, and strategic planning activities that required sophisticated judgment and decision-making ability. The facility's improved performance under my ownership provided objective measures of my business competence and leadership effectiveness. When the judge announced his decision at the end of the hearing, he not only denied the conservatorship petition, but also issued a strong statement about the importance of protecting elderly people's autonomy against family members who might attempt to use legal proceedings to control decisions they disagreed with for personal rather than protective reasons. The judge specifically noted that my purchase and management of Meadowbrook demonstrated exactly the kind of creative, strategic thinking that should be encouraged among elderly people rather than suppressed through legal restrictions on their independence. He warned Thomas and his attorney about pursuing frivolous conservatorship proceedings that appeared to be motivated by personal financial interests rather than genuine concern for an elderly person's welfare. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by elder advocacy professionals and family members who had attended the hearing to observe the proceedings and learn from the outcome. Several people asked for information about the Meadowbrook model and my strategies for resisting family manipulation, recognizing that my success could provide a template for other elderly people facing similar challenges. The media coverage of the hearing generated additional interest in the Meadowbrook expansion project, with several investor groups reaching out to discuss funding opportunities for developing similar facilities in other regions. The public attention also attracted inquiries from elderly people and families who were seeking alternatives to traditional institutional care that would respect autonomy while providing appropriate support services. Most importantly, the successful defense against Thomas's conservatorship attempt established a legal precedent, demonstrating that elderly people could maintain their independence and resist family manipulation, even when faced with coordinated legal challenges. The outcome sent a clear message that age alone was not sufficient grounds for questioning someone's competence or restricting their autonomy. The weeks following the hearing were marked by a significant increase in applications for admission to Meadowbrook from elderly people who had learned about the facility through the media coverage and were seeking environments that would respect their dignity and independence. The waiting list grew to over 200 applicants, providing strong evidence that there was substantial demand for the kind of elder care I was providing. Rebecca and Daniel's behavior during and after the hearing demonstrated that they had genuinely learned to respect my autonomy and support my decision-making, rather than simply complying with visiting policies to maintain access to potential inheritance benefits. Their willingness to testify against Thomas's manipulative legal action showed real growth in their understanding of appropriate family relationships with elderly parents. The expansion project gained momentum as additional investors expressed interest in funding the development of facilities based on the Meadowbrook model in neighboring states. The combination of demonstrated resident satisfaction, financial sustainability, and legal validation of the innovative policies created confidence that the concept could be successfully replicated in other markets. As autumn turned to winter, I reflected on the dramatic transformation that had occurred since the morning when Rebecca and Daniel had ambushed me with their plans to warehouse me in institutional care. I had not only escaped their attempt to control my life, but had created a successful business that was helping other elderly people maintain their dignity and autonomy while generating interest from investors and professionals who recognized the potential for systemic change in elder care. The conservatorship challenge had been the most serious threat to my independence since I had taken control of my circumstances, but the successful defense had actually strengthened my position by providing legal validation of my competence and business judgment. The public attention had also created opportunities to expand the impact of the Meadowbrook model beyond what I had originally envisioned when I first decided to purchase the facility. Most satisfying was the knowledge that my resistance to family manipulation had inspired other elderly people to assert their own autonomy and had provided a template for challenging ageist assumptions about decision-making capacity. The visitor restrictions and family accountability measures that had initially seemed punitive to Rebecca and Daniel had ultimately created opportunities for rebuilding our relationships on foundations of mutual respect rather than paternalistic control. The success of the Meadowbrook transformation had exceeded my most optimistic expectations, demonstrating that elderly people could not only resist attempts to diminish their autonomy but could actually use their resources and experience to create positive change that benefited entire communities. Taking control of my own circumstances had led to opportunities for helping others while building a sustainable business that proved elder care could be both profitable and humane. The legal victory had cleared the way for focusing entirely on the expansion project and the ongoing improvements at Meadowbrook, but it had also established important principles about elderly people's rights to make their own decisions, even when families disagreed with those choices. The precedent would hopefully help other elderly people resist similar attempts at manipulation and control by family members who preferred convenience over genuine support for autonomy and dignity. The groundbreaking ceremony for Meadowbrook West took place on a crisp February morning, exactly 1 year after I had first walked into the conference room to reveal my ownership of the original facility to my stunned children. The new facility would house 120 residents in a campus-style setting that emphasized community gardens, workshop spaces, and flexible living arrangements designed to accommodate varying levels of independence and support needs. Standing at the podium, surrounded by local officials, investor representatives, and dozens of families who had been waiting for admission to a Meadowbrook facility, I felt the profound satisfaction of seeing an idea that had begun as personal survival transform into a movement that was changing how society thought about aging and elder care. The media coverage had attracted attention from advocacy groups across the country, and I had been invited to consult on similar projects in 8 different states. Rebecca stood near the front of the gathered crowd, holding a thick portfolio of marketing materials and expansion timelines that represented her new role as Director of Business Development for Meadowbrook Enterprise. Her transformation from someone who had viewed me as a problem requiring management to a professional colleague who valued my vision and leadership had been as dramatic as any other aspect of this journey. Daniel was operating the video camera that would document the ceremony for training materials and promotional purposes, having discovered a talent for visual storytelling that complemented his project management skills perfectly. His teenage son Marcus had spent the previous summer interning at the original Meadowbrook facility and was now planning to study gerontology and business administration in college, so he could eventually join the family enterprise. Jessica approached the podium as I finished my remarks to the crowd, carrying the bound copies of her published research on the Meadowbrook model that had been accepted for publication in 3 different professional journals. Her academic work had provided the scientific validation that convinced skeptical investors and regulatory agencies that our approach to elder care was not just innovative but measurably superior to traditional institutional models. The expansion had proceeded more rapidly than anyone had anticipated, driven by overwhelming demand from elderly people and families who were seeking alternatives to warehousing approaches to aging. The waiting list for both facilities now extended beyond 18 months, and we were actively planning additional locations in Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia to meet the documented need for dignity-centered elder care. More importantly, the success of the Meadowbrook model had inspired legislative initiatives in 4 states aimed at establishing minimum standards for family involvement in elder care placement decisions, and creating accountability measures to prevent the kind of manipulation that had originally brought me to Meadowbrook against my will. The visiting policies I had developed out of personal necessity were being studied and adapted by facilities across the region. The investors who had initially viewed the project as a risky experiment in alternative elder care were now competing to fund additional expansion, recognizing that the combination of resident satisfaction, family engagement, and financial sustainability created a replicable formula for transforming an entire industry. The business model had proven that treating elderly people with dignity and respect was not only morally imperative but also economically advantageous. After the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, I walked through the construction site where the foundation work was already underway for the main residential building. The architectural plans called for spacious private apartments with full kitchens, accessible workshop areas where residents could pursue hobbies and projects, and community spaces designed to encourage social interaction without forcing institutional programming on people who preferred solitude. The memory garden that would occupy the center of the campus was designed according to input from dozens of current and prospective residents who had shared their preferences for plants, seating arrangements, and pathways that would accommodate wheelchairs and walkers while still feeling natural and welcoming. Every aspect of the facility design reflected the principle that elderly people deserved environments that enhanced their quality of life, rather than simply managing their decline. Eleanor, who had successfully transitioned from Meadowbrook resident to independent living and was now serving as a consultant on resident advocacy issues, joined me as I toured the construction site. She pointed out the location where the facility's library and computer center would be installed, noting that the space had been designed to accommodate both traditional book collections and modern technology resources that would help residents maintain connections with the outside world. Margaret, who had relocated to North Carolina but remained involved with Meadowbrook as a volunteer coordinator, had contributed detailed recommendations for the activity programming that would be available to residents without being mandatory or infantile. Her experience as a retired teacher had been invaluable in developing educational and creative programs, that challenged residents intellectually while respecting their autonomy to participate or decline according to their personal interest. The staff hiring process for Meadowbrook West was already underway, with particular emphasis on recruiting individuals who understood and supported the facility's philosophy of resident empowerment rather than simple custodial care. The compensation packages were significantly higher than industry standards, reflecting our commitment to attracting employees who viewed elder care as meaningful professional work rather than just a job that required minimal qualification. Patricia Hendricks had been promoted to Regional Operations Director and was overseeing the development of training programs that would ensure consistency across all Meadowbrook facilities while allowing for local adaptations based on community needs and resident preference. Her experience managing the transformation at the original facility had provided valuable insights into the challenges and opportunities involved in implementing innovative elder care model. The family visiting policies that had originally been developed as a response to my personal situation had been refined and expanded based on feedback from residents, families, and staff members across the system. The current version included more flexible scheduling options and graduated accountability measures that could accommodate different family circumstances while maintaining the fundamental principle that elderly people deserved genuine support rather than perfunctory management. One of the most significant developments had been the creation of family education programs that helped adult children and other relatives understand how to maintain supportive relationships with aging family members without resorting to paternalistic control or institutional warehousing. The programs addressed common misconceptions about aging and provided practical strategies for respecting elderly people's autonomy while ensuring their safety and well-being. Rebecca had become particularly passionate about the family education component, using her marketing expertise to develop materials and presentations that challenged ageist assumptions and promoted more respectful approaches to intergenerational relationships. Her work in this area had helped dozens of families avoid the kind of conflicts that had originally characterized our relationship before I took control of my own circumstance. Daniel's project management background had been crucial for coordinating the complex logistics involved in opening multiple facilities while maintaining quality standards and regulatory compliance. His attention to detail and systematic approach to problem-solving had helped streamline operations and reduce costs without compromising the enhanced services and amenities that distinguished Meadowbrook facilities from traditional elder care institutions. The financial success of the Meadowbrook enterprise had exceeded all projections, generating sufficient revenue to fund continued expansion while maintaining the enhanced staffing levels, improved food services, and comprehensive programming that created superior resident experience. The waiting lists and premium pricing demonstrated that families were willing to pay more for elder care that actually cared for elderly people rather than simply managing them as problems. More importantly, the success had attracted attention from policy researchers and healthcare economists who were studying the Meadowbrook model as a potential template for reforming elder care financing and regulation at the state and federal level. The demonstration that high-quality, resident-centered care could be financially sustainable was influencing discussions about Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement policy. The academic conferences where I had been invited to present the Meadowbrook model had generated interest from international delegations studying American approaches to aging service. Representatives from Canada, Australia, and several European countries had visited the original facility to observe operations and discuss potential adaptations for their own healthcare system. Jessica's research had expanded beyond documentation of the Meadowbrook model to broader studies of family dynamics in elder care decision-making and the psychological impacts of institutional versus community-based approaches to aging services. Her work was contributing to a growing body of academic literature that challenged traditional assumptions about what elderly people needed and wanted from care providers. The recognition that my personal resistance to family manipulation had evolved into a systematic approach to elder advocacy was both gratifying and somewhat overwhelming. The speaking engagements and consulting requests that resulted from media coverage of the Meadowbrook story often felt surreal, as if the desperate woman who had been ambushed by her children in her own kitchen had been replaced by a professional expert whose opinions were sought by universities and government agencies. However, the real measure of success was not the external recognition, but the daily evidence that elderly people at Meadowbrook facilities were living with dignity and purpose, rather than simply waiting to die in institutional settings. The stories of residents who had rekindled old interests, developed new friendships, and maintained meaningful connections with their communities demonstrated that aging did not have to mean accepting diminished expectations or reduced autonomy. The relationships with Rebecca and Daniel had stabilized into genuine partnerships based on shared commitment to the Meadowbrook mission rather than obligatory family duties or financial self-interest. Their professional contributions to the enterprise were valued because of their competence and dedication, not because of family relationships, and our personal interactions had become more honest and respectful than they had been since they were young adults. Thomas had disappeared from our lives entirely after his failed conservatorship attempt, apparently recognizing that his manipulative tactics would not succeed against the comprehensive legal and financial protections I had established. The divorce proceedings between him and Rebecca had concluded with minimal disruption to family relationships, and Rebecca had moved forward with her career and personal life without the toxic influence of his opportunistic scheme. The legal precedent established by my successful defense against conservatorship proceedings had been cited in several subsequent cases involving elderly people resisting family attempts to control their autonomy. Elder law attorneys across the region were using the documentation strategies and expert witness approaches that Edward Morrison had developed to help other clients maintain their independence against manipulative relatives. The expansion of Meadowbrook facilities was creating employment opportunities for social workers, healthcare professionals, and support staff who were committed to dignity-centered approaches to aging services. The higher wages and better working conditions were attracting talented individuals who might otherwise have chosen careers outside elder care, gradually improving the overall quality of professionals working in the field. The community gardens at each Meadowbrook facility had become popular gathering places where residents, staff members, and family visitors could work together on projects that provided both physical activity and tangible accomplishment. The gardens also supplied fresh vegetables and herbs for facility kitchens, reducing food costs while improving nutrition and connecting residents with the satisfaction of productive work. The workshop spaces where residents could pursue woodworking, crafts, writing, and other creative projects had proven equally popular, providing opportunities for elderly people to maintain or develop skills that gave them sense of purpose and accomplishment. The facilities regularly hosted exhibitions of resident artwork and performances of original music and writing that challenged stereotypes about aging and creativity. The flexibility of living arrangements at Meadowbrook facilities allowed couples to remain together even when one partner required more support services than the other, and provided options for residents whose needs changed over time without forcing them to relocate to different institutions. The campus-style designs encouraged social interaction while respecting individual preferences for privacy and independence. The success of the Meadowbrook model had inspired other entrepreneurs and healthcare professionals to develop similar approaches to elder care in their own communities, creating a network of facilities that shared resources, training materials, and best practices for resident-centered care. The collaborative approach was helping to accelerate improvements in elder care quality across the industry. As I stood in my office at the original Meadowbrook facility one evening, reviewing applications from families hoping to secure admission for elderly relatives, I reflected on the journey that had begun with such fear and humiliation in my own kitchen. The woman who had been treated as disposable by her own children had become an advocate for thousands of elderly people who deserved better than institutional warehousing. The financial resources that Frank and I had accumulated through decades of careful saving had been transformed from passive investments into active tools for social change that were improving lives and challenging systemic aging. The money that Rebecca and Daniel had assumed they would inherit was instead generating ongoing benefits for elderly people and their families while creating sustainable businesses that would continue the mission long after I was gone. The legacy that I was building through Meadowbrook Enterprises was more meaningful than anything I could have achieved by simply accepting the limitations that others had tried to impose on my age. The decision to fight back against family manipulation had led to opportunities for helping other people resist similar treatment while demonstrating that elderly people could be innovators and leaders rather than simply recipients of care. The visiting policies that had originally been designed to protect me from Rebecca and Daniel's neglectful behavior had evolved into comprehensive family engagement strategies that were helping repair damaged relationships and prevent future conflicts between elderly people and their adult children. The accountability measures were encouraging genuine care and support rather than superficial duty fulfillment. Most importantly, the success of the Meadowbrook transformation had proven that elderly people possessed wisdom, creativity, and determination that society was wasting when it relegated them to passive roles in institutional settings. The residents who had rediscovered their voices and reclaimed their autonomy were contributing to their communities in ways that benefited everyone involved. The phone on my desk rang, interrupting my reflections, and I answered to hear the voice of an elderly woman in Ohio who had read about Meadowbrook in a magazine article and was asking whether I could help her resist her family's pressure to move to a nursing home against her will. As I listened to her story and began explaining the resources and strategies that might help her maintain her independence, I realized that the transformation I had experienced was continuing to ripple outward in ways I was still discovering. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.